The 9/11 Commission report was a cover-up from beginning to end. What isn't clear is why our government and subsequent governments under subsequent presidents would want to continue that lie and cover up what actually happened on 9/11. What exactly were they hiding? And more important, who were they protecting?
Tucker Carlson just exposed the truth regarding the government's 9/11 cover-up, and in this clip he talks about how the 9/11 Commission was an orchestrated entity that was designed to match the administration's narrative and cover up and omit things that were pertinent to that day and the atrocities that consumed it. So let's give this a listen. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
In January 2000, as the CIA was tracking two future hijackers as they journeyed to Los Angeles, George W. Bush was 7 months into his presidential campaign.
What we're going to do is we're going to do something no other presidential candidate has been able to do. The near impossible. Remember what it was? The near impossible turn like that. One of the most exhilarating moments of my political career, and yours too.
His campaign was working to take down his opponent at the time, Arizona Senator John McCain, by spreading rumors he'd fathered a black bastard child with a prostitute.
You should be ashamed. You should be ashamed.
The following December, two other hijackers, Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of the plot, and Marwan al-Shehi, were finishing their pilot training in Venice, Florida, on the West Coast. In Washington, the Supreme Court ruled that George W. Bush had won the 2000 election. John McCain wanted to get political revenge. When he got his chance 10 months later, it would have historic consequences. The official story of what happened on 9/11 comes from a single report, the 9/11 Final Report of the National Commission. In the 2 decades since it was released, it has become the basis for all media coverage of terror attacks that day. What the media never mention is that the commission itself was a farce. It was intentionally underfunded, it was poorly structured, it was from top to bottom corrupt. 2 years after the report was released, the commission's own chairman admitted it was set up to fail.
Americans have many questions tonight. Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
Beginning in the first hours after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the Bush administration began leveraging the tragedy to launch their next project, a so-called global war on terror.
That's exactly what they did. They started a war against an abstraction, not the first one. There was the war on drugs and the war on poverty. These abstract wars just give the government unlimited powers, as they did on this day. And Tucker's right about the 9/11 Commission report. It's almost like a meme now that the government investigated the government and determined that the government did nothing wrong. Well, nothing is more emblematic of that than the 9/11 Commission report. It has all sorts of issues, not the least of which are, no matter how you think about it or what you believe about it, the toppling of Building 7 is barely mentioned at all, let alone an explanation for that. You didn't have any information that was accurate concerning Omar al-Bayoumi, a Saudi intelligence asset, and how he set up two of the hijackers, supposedly coincidentally meeting them in San Diego with their first, apartment lease signage and the ability to get driver's licenses. We were supposed to believe that that was a chance encounter, and that's what's written in that commission report. And it's all sorts of other omissions like this that have painted a skeptical streak when it comes to that report and hiding the Saudi involvement, which they redacted some of the end pages of the report, not to divulge those until something like, 20 years later. So that's where we're at. Tucker's right.
The evidence we have gathered all points to a collection of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations known as Al-Qaeda.
In a normal country, its leaders would insist on an answer to the simple question: how did a terror network closely monitored by the United States intelligence agencies, including a unit dedicated to following them at CIA headquarters in Langley, how did a group like that manage to pull off the 9/11 attacks in broad daylight? That's the question. But this is not a normal country, and it was never answered. In fact, the Bush administration ferociously opposed any attempt to look carefully at what happened that day. And that presents a bigger question. Why? What did they have to hide?
My name is Kristen Breitweiser. My husband Ron was killed on September 11th.
Breitweiser is one of 4 9/11 widows who became famous at the time as the, quote, Jersey Girls. They were some of the only people in public life in the United States who wouldn't let it go. They didn't believe the official 9/11 story, and they often said so. They were all over the media for several years, determined to identify government officials who may have been complicit in the tragedy.
Yeah, these ladies were called conspiracy nuts, right? We saw the same thing against those that protested, the idea that the government is going to shut down society over this virus in the air, and we'd have to have religious worship restrictions, our basic rights would have to be curtailed, businesses would have to be closed, and you're a conspiracy theorist if you stood against this, or didn't want the government to be able to have the power to mandate the injections of a big pharma vaccine into your veins. These ladies were treated that same way in the days after 9/11, despite having lost loved ones, for pushing back against this cover-up, against this scheme to admit pertinent information about government foreknowledge and their supposedly inability to stop these attacks before they happen. And, she got drugged through the dirt over it. And she wasn't the only one. It was everyone doing that at that time.
In the end, they were ignored.
We were looking at a Bush administration that really was not interested in looking backwards. There was a push to immediately go to war. There was an invasion into Afghanistan, and then there was the queue up for the war in Iraq.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Rather than get to the bottom of what actually happened, the Bush administration immediately exploited the crisis to push for what it really wanted, which was an invasion of Iraq.
That's exactly what they wanted to do. Bush's approval rating was the highest in U.S. history, something like 89 or 90% or something like that. I think this is the last real time that American conservatives have had some pull over the culture. And look at how much they squandered it in the days after this with the DHS and the Patriot Act and the 20-year occupation of Iraq, 20-year occupation of Afghanistan. And just all for nothing, all for those liberties to be robbed from all of us and to weaponize the state against dissidents of the state. Using foreign powers as the excuse, as they always do, robbing us of our liberties while saying that the threat's always external, trying to pit us against each other while they did this. This is exactly what happened.
In his book, Against All Enemies, George W. Bush's counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke said that when he went back to the White House immediately after 9/11, he, quote, expected to go back to a round of meetings examining what the next attacks would be, what our vulnerabilities were. Instead, he realized with what he called almost sharp physical pain that Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz were going to take advantage of the tragedy to promote their agenda about Iraq. And that's exactly what they did. On the afternoon of September 11th, Rumsfeld said his instinct was to hit Saddam Hussein at the same time, not only bin Laden. The day after the attack, Bush asked Clarke to see if Saddam did this, see if he's involved in any way. And while meeting with the president on September 15th at Camp David, Wolfowitz argued that Iraq was ultimately the source of the terrorist problem and should therefore be attacked.
Of course they did this. This was always the project of the New American Century's goal. This is a think tank of neocons like David Wurmser and Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and all the people that wrote about how America just needed a new Pearl Harbor, such that we could exert influence throughout the world in empire-building schemes. That is basically the summation of what their draft documentation said, that, hey, we live in this unipolar era at the end of the Cold War, and it's time to take advantage of that by really sticking it to Saddam Hussein. It's what they wanted from the jump. And 9/11 provided them the opportunity to do that. I mean, it was almost like a strike of fate that the stars were aligning in the exact way that these vile neocons wanted, and we've all paid the price because of it, I'm sorry to say. So, Richard Clarke is a controversial figure. A lot of people don't think he tells the full truth, but this does comport to the things that people that were in the neocon atmosphere, were in that world, were talking about related to what America needed to do to kind of cement its hegemony throughout the world.
The Bush administration, which at the time was enjoying a historic 90% approval rating, was pushing a very clear storyline. They told the country that Osama bin Laden had simply caught American authorities off guard.
There was no silver bullet that could have prevented the 9/11 attacks.
That was a lie. And by May of 2002, more than 2/3 of Americans understood that it was a lie. They wanted an investigation into the so-called intelligence failures that led to the attack. The initial effort to investigate 9/11 was a joint congressional commission led by Senator Bob Graham, a Democrat of Florida, and Congressman Porter Goss, a former CIA officer who would later become the agency's director, appointed by Bush.
These public hearings are part of our search for truth.
Cheney did not want anyone looking into his failures that day, the administration's failures, and more than anything, I think he and the political strategist Karl Rove were very focused on the president's reputation, on ensuring that he would get reelected.
The lengths that the Bush administration went to kill the investigation into 9/11 are shocking. In the winter of 2002, Dick Cheney called the then Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle of South Dakota and made a threat. The Veep told Daschle the leaders of the war on terror would be too busy to get bogged down in preparing for and testifying in front of the committees. The strong implication of this, if you insist, will say you're interfering with the war effort.
Yeah, of course, that's what they did, and there is a lot of evidence to suggest there was foreknowledge outside of what Tucker covered in his first episode, which detailed the CIA plot to recruit two of the 9/11 hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar, as inside men into al-Qaeda, and let that play out in San Diego, tracking them to the United States, knowing they were terrorists overseas in what was called al-Qaeda's Nairobi cell. They flew over to the United States, and a Saudi asset was being used as a proxy to do that, Omar al-Bayoumi, but they weren't going to tell the FBI about it. Mark Rossini, the whistleblower, the FBI whistleblower, has talked about this. And outside of that, look at this document. This is a declassified document that the government has acknowledged, by the way, talking about how bin Laden was determined to strike in the United States. This came across the president's desk, I believe, something like 30 days before 9/11, talking about how bin Laden wanted to follow up the bombings of the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania and the bombing of the USS Cole with a domestic strike. Totally ignored completely by the feds. And, you know, if you ask why, you're just a conspiracy nut, right? Just like always.
The committee moved forward anyway. On June 19, 2002, they discovered that the NSA had intercepted messages from al-Qaeda operatives from the day before the attacks, saying, quote, "The match begins tomorrow," and "Tomorrow is zero day." It couldn't have been clearer. Someone on the committee leaked those messages to the news media. CNN broadcast them. And in retaliation for this, for telling the truth, the Bush administration sicked the FBI, then run by Robert Mueller, on the committee.
The FBI, really came down hard on the joint inquiry. They polygraphed, they interviewed, they made all kinds of threats. And so, when the FBI comes after you, it's kind of scary because you're looking at not only, potentially losing your position in Congress, but also imprisonment.
It was pure intimidation.
And so it had a very chilling effect, in my opinion, on the progress of the inquiry and their investigation.
Yeah, every time that you have a commission like this that's designed to protect the government has the impulse and incentive to stack it in ways that are advantageous to the government narrative. That's exactly what Cheney did. That's what Rumsfeld did. That's what Kissinger tried to do before he resigned. Maybe we'll talk about that here.
In the end, Congress did make some interesting discoveries, most of which were redacted in the final report. The Jersey Girls continued to push for the truth. They were furious. They demanded an independent commission. George W. Bush's political enemies agreed. John McCain's revenge was an independent commission that would explore the truth about what happened on 9/11.
This legislation that calls for a blue ribbon commission to examine the facts surrounding September 11th.
On November 27, 2002, President Bush, fearing major political blowback if he vetoed the commission, signed the bill into law. But he managed to neuter the commission in the process. His allies in Congress gave the commission weak subpoena power and limited them to a strict 18-month timeline. They appropriated for the entire investigation just $3 million. By Washington standards, it was nothing. By comparison, Congress gave 13 times more funding to investigate the Monica Lewinsky scandal. It appropriated 11 times more funding for Robert Mueller's investigation into Russiagate. The administration and the Congress simply didn't want the public to know what happened on 9/11. But
that's exactly right. The thing that I would add to this, though, is initially he's totally right. $3 million was the budget. That was raised plus $9 million in 2003. So I'm not saying he's wrong, and that still is, unprecedented. It's a very low amount of money to allocate to a commission like this to investigate a serious terrorist atrocity where there was a lot of skepticism toward the government narrative, such that, hey, I took a look at this, and what commissions during the Bush presidency cost more? Well, the Iraq Survey Group, this was the group determined to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, cost $1 billion. So that's 33 times more money than what they initially dedicated to the 9/11 Commission report. In this case, the intelligence capabilities regarding weapons of mass destruction, a secondary committee, $10 million allocated, 3 times more than the 9/11 Commission. And these three as well, Global Change Research Program, a commission on the National Guard, and National Prison Rape and Elimination Commission. These commissions, which I guarantee you've never heard of unless you dove into this, all were funded to a greater extent than the 9/11 Commission at first. I did add the part about, hey, they did get additional funding to add additional context, but Tucker's still right on the money here. This was underfunded, and it seemed to be by design. The only thing I'll say is that McCain was totally complicit with a government narrative. I don't really think he wanted to get back at the president in that way. He might have been bitter about losing the race for the nomination in 2000, but at the same time, he was in lockstep with Bush over how this was handled and what was going to come after it in terms of the global war on terror.
But that wasn't the only thing they did to subvert the truth.
The White House, one of the ways that they controlled the commission was they were going to choose the chairman.
Their first choice was Henry Kissinger.
Today, I'm pleased to announce my choice for commission chairman, Dr. Henry Kissinger.
At the time, I was like 30 years old, so I had known Kissinger, but I didn't really, as a stay-at-home suburban housewife, it's not like I, had dived into all of Henry Kissinger's horrible acts and his status as a war criminal.
Dr. Kissinger is one of our nation's most accomplished and respected public servants.
Kissinger had served as National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State under Richard Nixon. He pushed a massive expansion of the Vietnam War, including secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos.
There are questions about his role in Vietnam, his role in the coup in Chile.
When we first met him, he gave us this long talk about how honored it was, and it was like the, not the opportunity, but like a responsibility of a lifetime.
Yeah, of course, and this is the butcher of Cambodia, a war criminal responsible for countless deaths, had the pressing architectural involvement in the coup that replaced Salvador Allende with Augusto Pinochet with help from the CIA. This is a man responsible for countless deaths. I think he just passed away like a year or two ago. One of the most vile and reprehensible statesmen, if you want to call him that, because I don't liken him to a statesman. I liken him to a war criminal. And beyond that, his individual business dealings were a massive conflict of interest in this role.
It is a great honor to be appointed by the president to be chairman of the nonpartisan independent commission.
In 2002, he was running a lucrative consulting business called Kissinger Associates.
I really spent a bit of time researching him, predominantly his clients. And we had grave concerns that he was chosen by the vice president and the president and Karl Rove because he was really good at what he does. And so we were also concerned about his clients and that he had a huge conflict of interest. And so we were invited to meet with him at his offices on Park Avenue. We were put into his office. It was kind of close quarters. It was really, really hot. He had the heat turned up to like 100 degrees. And, it was the winter, so we had like turtlenecks on and sweaters and stuff. So we're like sitting there like sweating. And he's just sitting there calmly.
Cranking up the thermostat is a well-known manipulation strategy. If you make a room uncomfortably hot, The discomfort puts pressure on the other negotiating party to make concessions more quickly.
So at one point, after we got through the niceties, one of the widows had asked him who his clients were. Do you represent any Saudi royals? Do you represent anyone in the bin Laden family? And, you know, at the time, it wasn't that much of an outrageous question because there were members of the bin Laden family who had relationships with, you know, the Bush family and others. And so it wasn't like it was an outrageous question. And he immediately got flustered and, you know, went to pick up a cup of tea or coffee and spilled it on the table. He feigned that it was his fake eye, which didn't know that he had a fake eye. And
he had a fake brain too, or at least a brain that was hell-bent on killing people.
We immediately went to like clean it up like moms, you know, like, oh, it's okay. And then he just never answered the question. And then the very next day he resigned.
Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger stepped down from the position Friday.
Scrambling to find a new chairman, Bush.
Before they go into the new chairman thing, I wanted to note that it has come out in confirmations that Kissinger did have business dealings via his own firm with members of the bin Laden family, which was a, you know, very rich construction dynasty. If you're not aware of this, bin Laden's father was essentially given a monopoly, a business monopoly by the Saudi ruler to rebuild holy sites in and around the Arabian Peninsula, and that's how the bin Laden family gained so much money. I think members of the bin Laden family went into, you know, oil and other business practices and ventures regarding that, and as a stretch out from infrastructure, but it's been confirmed that he did have this conflict of interest, that the Jersey Girls weren't just blowing a load of smoke. This is actually what was true, and you can see his diversionary tactics trying to get away from it. So, you know, that's not the last of the evils of Kissinger, you know, based upon his historical record, but it is true.
Bush's top political advisor, Karl Rove, called former New Jersey Governor Tom Kean and offered him the job. Why was George W. Bush's political bagman making this phone call? No one's ever explained.
Tom is the nicest guy on the planet. He's very much a gentleman. He does not go for the jugular.
After he accepted the job, Kean was dragged to the White House where the president's top advisors told him, "We want you to stand up. You've got to stand up. You've got to have courage. We don't want a runaway commission." In other words, do what we say.
The White House's fingerprints were certainly all over the commission.
Chairman Kean ultimately admitted the commission was, quote, set up to fail. And that's absolutely true. But in addition to a meaningless budget, the tight timeline, and weak subpoena power, there was another problem: the man Kean selected to run it. On January 27, 2003, the commission issued a press release announcing they'd selected an academic called Philip Zelikow to be the commission's executive director.
He was sold to us as a historian. I was responsible for the research for Zelikow to make sure that he didn't have any conflicts of interest. He had a lot of conflicts of interest.
The release describes Zelikow as, quote, a man of high stature who had distinguished himself as an academician, a lawyer, author, and public servant. The release did not note that Zelikow was an active Bush administration official. He served on a White House intelligence advisory panel. It also failed to note his extensive ties to Condoleezza Rice. He'd served on her transition team. He'd co-authored a book with Rice in 1995. In 2002, at Rice's behest, Zelikow authored a policy paper championing preemptive invasions. And this cemented his role as a key architect of the disastrous invasion of Iraq. Zelikow was the perfect person to keep the commission from finding the truth.
Yeah, he sure was. He had such deep conflicts of interest with this too. Writing a book with Condoleezza Rice, he was a neocon in the Bush cutout vein, echoing their foreign policy views on everything. And it's worth noting too that one of the 9/11 commissioners, Max Cleland, resigned, saying that this was a national scandal, the fact that these conflicts of interest existed, and that the White House was stonewalling the commission, not initially even wanting to have it, then underfunding it. And he said that officials were, quote, this is his exact quote, protecting their asses rather than seeking the truth. So that tells you everything you need to know in addition to everything else.
I believe he was placed there to, again, play the gatekeeper, to ensure that the commission would not unearth the truth, and more than anything to protect the Bush administration and also lay the groundwork for the war in Iraq, in addition to other things.
Zelikow's first move was to pre-write the entire report before the facts were in. In March of 2003, before the investigation had even begun, Zelikow had already prepared a detailed outline complete with chapter headings, subheadings, and sub-subheadings. He kept all of this a secret from the rest of the staff.
As it turned out, his outline is nearly verbatim to what the final book looks like. And so what I believe is that he just basically had the outline, knew that it was a quote-unquote safe outline. It was probably approved by the Bush administration.
His second move was to consolidate his power. Zelikow gave himself total control over the hiring process.
He at first tried to block the staffers from communicating with the commissioners.
In a now public memo, Zelikow cut off his staff's access to the commissioners. Quote, "If you are contacted by a commissioner with questions, please contact Deputy Director Chris Kojum or me." Zelikow restricted access to documents. He divided the staff into separate teams. He siloed them from each other. And he closely supervised Team 3. That was the group that dealt with classified information from the White House and the CIA.
And by the way, the 9/11 Commission got almost no access to it. What Tucker said about weak subpoena power is right, and Zelikow steered this committee into essentially not being able to be privy to the answers they're designed to get, or supposedly designed to get, right? They only used their subpoena power once against the FAA to get NORAD tapes. That's the Aerospace Defense Department of the government, where there were audio conversations about the attacks as they were happening. They did get access to that, but did they get access to all sorts of very pertinent CIA, NSA documentation? No. And a lot of it is because of Zelikow trying to prevent their accessing this information. And that's why we never got the full answer. That's why this presentation has to happen 24 years later. That's why.
One of Zelikow's first moves was a secret agreement with the Justice Department to block access to the files of the congressional inquiry until the White House had had a chance to review them first.
Zelikow was sort of limiting access to documents when people were requesting specific things. Zelikow would block it.
Notably, the final report contains a full 61 references to finding no evidence of certain claims about 9/11.
The cute way of explaining why Zelikow uses that phrase is that if you don't look for the evidence, you don't find the evidence. And so you're not lying when you say we found no evidence.
At one point, a staffer overheard Zelikow pressuring a CIA employee to accept Condoleezza Rice's recollection of intel briefings before the 9/11 attacks. Most damning of all, phone logs kept by Zelikow's assistant show that he was regularly taking calls from both Condoleezza Rice and Karl Rove, George W. Bush's top political advisor in the White House. We reached out to Karl Rove for an explanation of this, and he denied having been in regular contact with Zelikow. But that is untrue. Even Zelikow himself acknowledges he received multiple calls from Karl Rove, but he claims they did not discuss the commission. He doesn't say what they did discuss. None of it is plausible.
Yeah, also Norman Mineta, the transportation secretary, testified to the 9/11 Commission that Dick Cheney essentially, he interpreted some of the comments that he heard in the bunker that Cheney was in to indicate that he had issued a shoot down order on Flight 77, the one that, was headed to, was that the one? Yeah, headed to the Pentagon. Supposedly, he believes that he was interpreting Cheney's comments to mean that Cheney, was trying to get jets to scramble and shoot that down. That was also suppressed from being able to be accessed by the 9/11 Commission and didn't make it into the final report. Just another aspect of this nightmarish cover-up.
It wasn't even like he was on the National Security Council. He didn't really have any information that would be helpful to the commission. Why is the commission's staff director having communications with the White House's political strategist?
From the outset, the commission started to advance the interests of Bush's neocon foreign policy agenda. When Team 3, the counterterrorism group, submitted their draft to Zelikow, he inserted sentences that tried to link al-Qaeda to Iraq to suggest the terrorist network had repeatedly communicated with the government of Saddam Hussein in the years before 9/11. and that bin Laden had seriously weighed moving to Iraq. In the end, those sentences were removed after staffers alerted the commissioners. But the commissioners did not prevent Zelikow from stacking public hearings with discredited neocons who towed the White House line about Iraq's connections to al-Qaeda, none of which were real. The first outside expert to testify to the commission was the Hoover Institute's Abraham Sofar. His written remarks to the commission include 8 references to Iraq and 5 references to Saddam Hussein. Keep in mind, this was a hearing on 9/11, which had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein or Iraq. Sofar spent most of his time at the public hearing talking about the need for preemptive invasions.
The need for preemptive actions stems ultimately from the conditions of modern life.
At the third hearing, Zelikow produced a florid and widely discredited neocon called Lori Milroy from the American Enterprise Institute. She appeared as a witness.
There is substantial reason to believe that these masterminds are Iraqi intelligence agents.
They were so desperate to link Saddam with bin Laden, this mythical idea that the two were working in tandem to subvert the United States because they wanted to overthrow both al-Qaeda with Afghanistan, the regime that was, supposedly harboring it, even though it seems like the leadership of the Taliban didn't exactly like bin Laden. They viewed him as a thorn in their side to some extent. Certainly so. It certainly drew the ire of the United States against them more than once, where targeted strikes hit Afghanistan because of the presence of bin Laden there. So, this is what they were desperate to do, to sell us a regime overthrow in Iraq, which, by the way, Israel wanted too. Benjamin Netanyahu in 2002 testified to Congress that, "I guarantee you, if you overthrow Saddam, positive reverberations will break out among the region." All of that absurdity that was sold to the public was based on this propaganda campaign that had no basis in fact, but for the ambitions of the neocons.
By April of 2004, former Senator Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, a Democrat, confronted Rice about Zelikow's ties to the administration.
Let me just ask you directly, and you can just give me keep it relatively short, but I wanted to get it on the record. Since he was an expert on terrorism, did you ask Philip Zelikow any questions about terrorism during transition, since he was the second person carded in the National Security Office and had considerable expertise?
Philip and I had numerous conversations about the issues that we were facing. Philip was, in fact, as you know, had worked in the campaign and helped with the transition plan. So yes.
Yes, you did talk to him about terrorism?
We talked, Philip and I, over a period of, we had worked closely together as academics.
Just during the transition, did you instruct him to do anything on terrorism?
Oh, to do anything on
Yes.
terrorism? To help us think about the structure of the terrorism, the Dick Clark's operations, yes.
Incredibly, the man in charge of the official story of 9/11, Philip Zelikow, was the Bush administration advisor who decided to demote the White House's counterterrorism czar Dick Clark in the months before 9/11. Yet somehow these details, central though they are, were left out of the commission's final report. The 9/11 Commission report was a cover-up from beginning to end. That is true. And that's the most important starting point for those seeking to understand what actually happened on September 11th. The official story is a lie. What isn't clear is why our government and subsequent governments under subsequent presidents would want to continue that lie and cover up what actually happened on 9/11. What exactly were they hiding? And more important, who were they protecting?
Great questions, and that's exactly right. This is getting to the bottom of what we should know, what should be a blockbuster story about foreknowledge and government corruption in handling this investigation and setting up this commission in a way that would fail the public and back the government narrative completely. Tucker is right about this. And, all you have to say is that they were so desperate to sell this as an abstract war on terror such that they could launch the invasion of Iraq that it became a major focal point, even in the days after 9/11. And we can see that in many ways. For instance, Bush framed Iraq as part of the war on terror in several major speeches, and including the speech about the axis of evil containing Iraq and Iran and North Korea. You know, they used the juxtaposition of terms to try to link the two, farcically so. And in some major speeches, they did this same trick to try to pull wool over the eyes of the American people in this era of mass public support for Bush. A very unprecedented era where, as Tucker said, he had 90% approval. They said the attacks of September 11th showed what the enemies of America did with 4 airplanes. We will not wait to see what terrorists or terror states do with weapons of mass destruction. So they're trying to merge these two together as if they're indistinguishable, talking about, hey, Iraq's government openly praised the attacks of September 11th. That must mean they're in cahoots. This was all absurd, and it was because of the neocon nightmare foreign policy that we're living in the age we do now. It's because the uniparty has taken over such that there isn't really an anti-war liberal establishment anymore, like there actually was during the invasion of Iraq. You saw protests in the streets for it. I think those protests mostly ended the day Obama signed into office because, you know, the liberal establishment was then captured by the military-industrial complex, backing wars in Syria and Libya and the drone wars in Yemen. But what's so ironic about this is how presidents campaign versus how they operate in office. That's no different now with Trump. But just take a look at this, what George Bush said in his campaign, and then looking at this video and how they handled the 9/11 cover-up and foreign policy to come after it. Look at what he says about U.S. foreign policy.
It really depends upon how our nation conducts itself in foreign policy. If we're an arrogant nation, they'll resent us. If we're a humble nation but strong, they'll welcome us. And our nation stands alone right now in the world in terms of power, and that's why we've got to be humble, and yet project strength in a way that promotes freedom. So I don't think they ought to look at us in any way other than what we are. We're a freedom-loving nation, and if we're an arrogant nation, they'll view us that way. But if we're a humble nation, they'll respect us.
Yeah, not exactly humble, the U.S. foreign policy regime in Bush's presidency or after that, certainly not whatsoever. We're a freedom-loving people, and we know that from our policies. Is that what the NSA mass surveillance program showed? Is that what the Patriot Act showed? Is that sticking your hands down grandmother's pants at the TSA lines at the airport? Does that show a love for freedom? And this whole farcical idea that they hated us for freedom, our freedom, is just absurd. Like bin Laden stumbled upon a copy of the Bill of Rights out on a dune somewhere in Saudi Arabia. No, it's because of U.S. foreign policy. And they told us that time and time again. It's something that the U.S. government just glossed over and pretended it didn't matter, that they were saying, hey, we don't like the fact that you're supporting Israel at all costs, militarizing the Arabian Peninsula, starving innocents in Iraq through a sanctions regime. Those were the things that Al-Qaeda complained about. And I'm not justifying the attacks whatsoever. They can never be justified. No attacks against innocent people can be justified, whether the U.S. does it or whether Al-Qaeda does it. But those are the reasons that we got into this morass from which we haven't gotten out of yet. But I do want to hear from you. Is Tucker Carlson right? Let me know down below. Is he right that this was a cover-up, that this was engineered to be a scheme to propagandize Americans to support the wars? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Tucker. This was an outstanding broadcast. I really appreciate it. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you like this video and my analysis, click the join button below and you can help support the channel. I would tip my hat to you in appreciation if you do that. And in return for that, as a gift, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube, the ones that are members only right now. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.